I always had a good relationship with Tiger, and when Tiger was looking for a coach, I don't. It's a short list you're picking from,
Of course.
and if you're Tiger Woods, and I was one of the people on that list, so it worked out pretty good for me. I mean, when he called me, and I pinched myself, and he said, "Would you, help me?" You can't believe you're getting that call.
He knew, before the surgeries, before the years of watching Tiger limp off course's invisible pain, before the world ranking collapsed outside the top 1,000, before the spinal fusion that changed everything. One man had already mapped out exactly how this would go. He said it out loud. He put it in a book. He attached his name to it and handed it to the world. And then the golf world buried him for it. Not subtly, not politely. They went after him with everything they had. This is the story of Hank Haney, the coach who saw the future clearly, said so plainly, and got punished for telling the truth. Tiger Woods is one of the greatest athletes who ever lived. That part is not up for debate. 14 major championships. A cultural footprint so massive that television ratings for golf events literally dropped when he was not in the field. A stretch of dominance in the early 2000s that made the rest of professional golf feel like a sideshow. Nobody earned that legacy without being something genuinely extraordinary. He was not just good, he was in a separate category. But greatness and invincibility are two entirely different things. And the people paid to protect Tiger's image spent years confusing one for the other. And the people paid to cover golf let them do it without much resistance. If you enjoy videos where the truth finally catches up to the spin, use the height feature and give this one some hype. It helps more than you might expect. Haney came into Tiger's world in 2004. He was already a respected coach before that, but working with the best player alive put him at a different level entirely. For 6 years, they worked side by side. 6 major championships in that stretch. The partnership was real, the results were undeniable, and the access Haney had was total. He saw everything: the practice habits, the training obsessions, the physical signals the body sends before it starts to break down. He was in rooms most people never get close to. When the working relationship ended in 2010, Haney did not go quietly. 2 years later, he published a memoir called The Big Miss. The reaction was immediate, and it was brutal. Tiger's camp moved fast. The word that kept appearing was bitter. Haney was framed as a disgruntled ex-employee who had violated the unspoken loyalty code between coach and player. A man cashing in on a private relationship for personal gain. Mainstream golf media largely echoed those sentiments without much pushback. The biomechanical warnings inside the book were dismissed as excuses dressed up in technical language. The specific, detailed portrait Haney painted of an athlete on borrowed physical time was treated as professional jealousy. The story the golf world wanted to keep telling was about Tiger the Invincible. Haney was inconvenient noise, and the noise had to be turned down. Here is what the noise actually said. The golf swing Tiger used was built for power and speed above all else, and it delivered both in historic quantities. But the mechanics required to produce that kind of clubhead velocity put the human body under forces that most casual fans never think about. The modern golf swing relies on explosive rotation, and that rotation creates enormous torque through the lower back. It also creates violent downward compression against the lead knee on every single swing. Not occasionally, every swing. Hundreds of times in a practice session, thousands of times across a season, tens of thousands of times across a career. Experts in professional golf physical therapy note that roughly half of all injuries treated at tour level involve the lower back, and a large portion of those trace directly back to the kind of rotational forces Tiger was producing repeatedly. His swing was not just aggressive in the way that great swings are aggressive. It was operating at the outer edge of what a human body can absorb without quietly accumulating structural damage over time. Haney saw this. He recognized the microtrauma building up in real time. He understood that bodies do not always announce when they are failing. The body whispers first, long before it screams. The whispers in Tiger's body were already getting louder during the years they worked together. What made the situation significantly worse was something the public did not know about at all. Tiger's obsession with military training went well beyond what any reasonable performance coach would have approved. He was drawn deeply into high-impact physical training with Navy SEALs in Coronado, California, including urban warfare simulations that had no relationship to what a professional golfer needs to do to preserve a competitive body. In 2007, inside a training environment known as a kill house, Tiger was kicked hard in the leg during an exercise. The impact caused a complete tear of the ligaments in his left knee. This injury was hidden. Nobody announced it. The narrative of Tiger as a self-contained physical specimen remained perfectly intact on the outside, while his structural foundation was quietly giving way on the inside. His knee was now compromised, and every swing from that point forward forced his body to compensate. The compensation added stress to joints that were not designed to absorb it. That misplaced stress was going to have to land somewhere eventually. The 2008 United States Open at Torrey Pines was one of the most celebrated performances in sports history. Tiger won an 18-hole playoff on a torn ACL and 2 stress fractures in his left leg. The media reached for every heroic description in the vocabulary: willpower, grit, the kind of thing only Tiger could do. What Haney's account revealed was a far less romantic picture. In the build-up to the tournament, Tiger could not practice in any normal sense. His preparation came down to hitting roughly 6 balls before retreating to a golf cart to rest his knee. Doctors had told him the joint was so severely damaged that competing could not make the structural injury any worse. Pain tolerance was the only remaining barrier. The media celebrated that. Haney understood what it actually meant. Playing through a destroyed knee did not prove toughness. It fed the chain reaction that was already underway. Every swing Tiger took at Torrey Pines was a swing taken by a body compensating hard for a joint that could no longer do its job. Those compensatory mechanics did not reset after the tournament ended. They settled in, and they gradually redirected all of the rotational stress from the swing straight into the lower back. The 4th knee surgery followed the tournament. Then came the escalating back problems. In 2014, Tiger withdrew from the Honda Classic and missed the Masters as the lumbar spine finally declared open war. His first microdiscectomy came that year. Haney was clear about what it signaled. He said this was not a routine setback. The damage already present in Tiger's spine, combined with a refusal to fundamentally change how he practiced and trained, made further breakdown essentially unavoidable unless drastic adjustments were made to his approach. Those adjustments were not made. 3 more back surgeries followed over the next 3 years. Tiger disappeared from elite professional golf so completely that his world ranking dropped outside the top 1,000. The man who had spent more than a decade dominating every leaderboard was now competing in almost no events at all. Between mid-2015 and early 2018, a generation of younger fans barely knew what a fully functional Tiger Woods looked like. By 2017, the damage at the lowest segment of his lumbar spine had passed the point where further surgery of the standard kind could help. Tiger underwent a spinal fusion at the L5 to S1 level. The procedure removes the destroyed disc entirely and inserts a structural cage packed with bone growth material. The spine is then fixed permanently using screws and rods, allowing the vertebrae above and below to fuse together into a single, rigid structure over about 6 months. That section of Tiger's spine would never move independently again. This is where Haney's prediction became impossible to deny. He had said Tiger would eventually be forced to completely rebuild his swing, not refine it, not tweak it, rebuild it from the ground up around permanent physical limitations. A fused spine cannot absorb rotational torque the same way. The surrounding joints must handle forces they were not originally designed to carry. Tiger's team spent years engineering a new swing around those realities, something flatter, more controlled, built to protect the fused section while still generating enough power to compete. That rebuilt swing produced one of the most emotional sports stories in recent memory. The 2019 Masters, a 5th green jacket. People cried watching it. It was real and it was earned. But the underlying fragility remained exactly where Haney had said it would. The high-volume training regimens of Tiger's prime were gone. The window for competitive golf was small and carefully managed. Then came the 2021 car crash, the emergency surgery for shattered bones in his right leg, and a permanent shift to a part-time competitive schedule built around physical survival rather than dominance. The full timeline matches Haney's roadmap point by point. The knee trauma from non-golf military training, the compensatory damage to the lumbar spine, the forced swing reconstruction, the limited physical window after fusion. Haney described all of it years before it happened, and he was called bitter and disloyal for doing so. The reason the golf world fought his account so hard had nothing to do with its accuracy. Tiger was a financial engine. Television contracts, equipment deals, sponsorship agreements, the commercial health of professional golf as a whole were woven around the myth of his invincibility. Questioning his physical sustainability threatened something much larger than just one athlete's reputation. The system protected itself by protecting the myth, and Haney's book was a direct threat to both. Sports science does not negotiate with public relations. The torque acting on a spine does not adjust for what a sponsor needs the story to be. Bodies follow physical laws, not press releases. Haney understood that in 2004, and he understood it in 2012, and every surgery that followed confirmed it. Tiger Woods is genuinely great. His fight to keep competing through everything his body has endured deserves real respect. None of that changes what Haney saw, what he said, and what the years proved. The coach was right. He paid for being right. And eventually, the truth caught up to all the people who had worked so hard to drown him out. Like the video, subscribe if you are not already, and leave a comment below telling us whether you believed Haney back in 2012 or whether it took everything that followed to change your mind. Think about what it actually takes to do what Haney did. You have spent 6 years working with the most famous athlete on the planet. You have won championships alongside him. You have been inside his world at the deepest level. When that ends, the easy path is silence. Stay quiet. Protect the relationship on paper. Let the myth run its course. Most people in sports take that road. The money is better, the social cost is lower, and nobody calls you names in print. Haney chose the other path. He wrote down what he observed. He explained in plain detail the biomechanical reasons Tiger's body was heading for a crisis. He put his name on it and published it in a world where Tiger Woods was still close to the peak of his cultural power. That took something. It took a willingness to be publicly humiliated, which is exactly what happened. The golf commentators who piled on in 2012 did not do so because they had better information. They did it because the story they needed to tell was different from the one Haney was telling. The equipment companies writing 7-figure checks, the television networks negotiating rights fees based on Tiger's magnetism, the writers whose access to Tiger's world depended on staying on the right side of his inner circle. All of them had a financial stake in the invincibility myth holding together. Haney had none of those incentives. He just had what he had seen with his own eyes over 6 years at the highest level of the sport. His account of the Killhouse injury alone should have ended the debate. A professional golfer competing at the highest level on a completely torn knee ligament. An injury that happened not on a golf course, but in a military training simulation. And the entire episode kept quiet, while the media continued painting a picture of an athlete who was simply built differently than other humans. The Torrey Pines victory is one of the most storied moments in golf history, and it genuinely should be. But the version of that story most people carried in their heads for years left out the part where Tiger was hitting 6 balls and then sitting in a cart because that was all his body would allow. The truth was not less impressive. It was just harder to package. What happened to Tiger's back after Torrey Pines follows an almost textbook pattern from a sports science perspective. When one joint becomes structurally unstable, the body finds ways to keep moving by shifting the load to surrounding structures. Tiger's damaged knee forced changes in how he distributed force during the downswing. Those changes moved stress progressively into the lumbar spine. The discs in the lower back absorbed that stress through thousands and thousands of additional repetitions on top of the torque they were already handling from the swing itself. The result was degeneration that could not be reversed through rest or physical therapy once it had reached a critical stage. Haney described this exact sequence. He was not speculating. He was drawing on what he had observed in real time during their years together and applying a straightforward understanding of how compensatory mechanics accumulate damage across a joint system. The fact that this description was dismissed as bitterness rather than engaged with as a substantive medical and biomechanical argument tells you more about the state of golf media than it does about the quality of Haney's analysis. The spinal fusion in 2017 was the point at which the conversation finally started to shift, at least in some corners. You cannot narrativize a fusion away. The hardware is in there permanently. The disc is gone. The motion is locked. When Tiger's team announced the procedure, the framing was still careful, still protective, still oriented around comeback possibilities rather than the structural reality of what a permanent spinal fusion means for a golfer's long-term range of motion and power generation. But the facts themselves were harder to spin, and the swing that emerged afterward, flatter, more controlled, built around physical limitation rather than athletic aggression, looked exactly like what Haney had said it would need to look like. The 2019 Masters win arrived at the exact right moment to complicate the narrative in the best possible way. It reminded everyone that Tiger Woods is not a case study. He is a human being who competed his way back from a physical situation that would have ended most careers permanently and stood on the 18th green at Augusta with the kind of moment that does not come around often in sports. The emotion in that crowd was real. The achievement was real. And Haney, to his credit, acknowledged it. His argument was never that Tiger could not come back or that surgery would end everything. His argument was about the structural limits that would define what coming back could actually look like. He was right about those limits, too. The practice time was gone. The grind that had defined Tiger's preparation for 2 decades was not compatible with a fused spine and a right leg rebuilt after a high-speed collision. What remained was a version of Tiger that could produce remarkable things in the right conditions over a short window, but could not sustain the relentless presence that had made him Tiger in the first place. Haney saw that ceiling years before anyone else would acknowledge it existed. The broader lesson sits well beyond golf. Sports science does not adjust its conclusions based on who is paying the bills. The physical laws governing torque and shear stress and disc degeneration operate the same way, regardless of what any broadcaster needs the story to be. Honest engagement was always owed, not a sustained campaign of character attacks. The vilification of Haney delayed a realistic public understanding of Tiger's situation for years. It did not change what was happening.
I knew we had the chance to win.
He was not allowed to join the rest of the reporters.
Allow us to play our best.
Phil Mickelson and Nick Faldo never liked each other much, and for most of their careers that barely mattered. They were 2 of the best golfers of their generation, playing an individual sport, orbiting each other at majors and cups without ever needing to get along. But over the last decade, their disagreements stopped being personal and started looking like something bigger. 2 very different ideas about what professional golf is for, and what a golfer owes the game that made him famous. This is the story of that disagreement. It runs through a press conference in Scotland, a fight over who owns the rights to a golf swing on video, a Saudi-backed league that split the sport in half, and a dinner table at Augusta National, where one of the most famous golfers alive sat in near silence. It ends for now in 2026, with Mickelson facing serious allegations that have nothing to do with any of that history, but that arrived at a moment when his standing in the game was already at its lowest point in decades. We'll lay out what happened, what Faldo said about it at the time, and what Mickelson has said in his own defense. Some of what follows is disputed. Some of it is simply 2 men seeing the same events in opposite ways. And some of it, especially the most recent chapter, involves accusations that have not been proven in any court and that Mickelson has not been convicted of. We'll be careful to keep that distinction clear throughout. 2 golfers, 2 philosophies. Start with the players themselves, because the shape of their careers explains a lot about why they clashed. Nick Faldo won 6 major championships, 3 Masters titles, and 3 Open championships. He spent 97 weeks at world number 1. He won 9 times on the PGA Tour and 30 times on tours outside the United States. And he remains Europe's all-time leading points scorer in Ryder Cup history with 11 appearances for the continent. His golf was built on repetition. In the mid-1980s, he tore his swing apart and rebuilt it from scratch, sacrificing a few seasons of results for a motion he trusted completely under pressure. On the course, he was known for being cold, controlled, and almost impossible to read. Often, he had a reputation for enforcing rules even when it cost him friendships. In the early 1980s, he reported his own playing partner, Sandy Lyle, for using anti-glare tape on his putter, and Lyle was disqualified. Many players thought that crossed a line. Faldo didn't apologize for it. He also had a famously prickly relationship with the British press, once thanking reporters after his 1992 Open win from the heart of my bottom. Phil Mickelson also won 6 majors, 3 Masters, 2 PGA championships, and 1 Open championship. But his career took a completely different shape. He won 45 times on the PGA Tour, more than any left-hander in history, and made 12 Ryder Cup appearances, the most of any American. He spent essentially no time at world number 1, mostly because he came up directly behind Tiger Woods. Where Faldo was calculated and repeatable, Mickelson built his game on risk, high, spinning flop shots, blind gambles from the trees, decisions other players wouldn't consider. Galleries loved him for it. He smiled, waved signed autographs for as long as anyone would let him, and became, in the words used to describe him at the time, a kind of modern Arnold Palmer, the fan favorite in a sport that Tiger Woods otherwise dominated. But the public warmth didn't extend evenly to Mickelson's fellow professionals. A GQ profile once described him as one of the most disliked players on tour among his peers, and one nickname reportedly followed him around the locker room: Fig Jam, short for a boast about his own talent. Some players believed his friendliness with fans was calculated. a performance that didn't match how he treated the people he competed against. That tension showed up early. In 1998, after winning a practice round bet against a young Tiger Woods, Mickelson left photocopies of the $100 bills he'd won inside Woods' locker, with a note joking that the money was happy in its new home. Woods, for his part, reportedly viewed Mickelson as an underachiever in those years, and the frost between them was obvious when the tour paired them together at the 2004 Ryder Cup at Oakland Hills. They lost both of their matches as partners. That early rivalry with Woods matters here because it establishes something important about how Mickelson has always operated within the game. He's never been especially interested in smoothing over tension with people he's competing against, even when smoothing it over would have been the easier or more conventional path. The locker room prank with Woods was by most accounts meant playfully, but it also revealed a competitor comfortable pushing right up to the edge of good sportsmanship, confident enough in his own standing to needle the sport's biggest rising star directly. That same instinct, a willingness to provoke rather than defer, would resurface again and again over the following 2 decades, at Gleneagles, in the media rights fight, and eventually in the LIV golf negotiations. It's not that Mickelson lacked the social skills to avoid conflict, it's that he consistently chose not to avoid it when he believed he had something to gain. So by the time Faldo and Mickelson's paths crossed seriously, one was a rule-following traditionalist with a reputation for coldness, and the other was a beloved risk-taker with a reputation among insiders for self-interest. That contrast is the backdrop for everything that followed. It's worth sitting with the numbers a little longer, because they explain why so many fans instinctively took Mickelson's side whenever this rivalry flared up. Faldo's dominance happened mostly out of view of American television, in an era before golf's global television audience had fully formed, and he built it through sheer grinding repetition rather than spectacle. Mickelson's career unfolded in the biggest media spotlight the sport has ever had, often standing directly in the shadow of Tiger Woods. And he built his following by doing the opposite of what Faldo valued, taking on risk in full view of the gallery for better or worse, shot after shot, tournament after tournament. A missed cut for Faldo often looked like quiet, technical failure. A blown lead for Mickelson usually looked like a wild, entertaining gamble that just didn't pay off. Fans forgave the second kind of failure far more easily than the first, and that difference in public perception shaped how each man's later conflicts were received. Gleneagles, 2014. The first real flashpoint came at the 2014 Ryder Cup at Gleneagles, Scotland, where Europe beat the United States decisively under captain Paul McGinley. The U.S. captain that year was 65-year-old Tom Watson, and his tournament had been rocky from the start. Watson benched Mickelson and his preferred partner, Keegan Bradley, during both Saturday sessions, a call that reportedly stunned some European players, including Ian Poulter, and that clearly damaged morale inside the American team room. After the loss, the U.S. team sat down for a press conference. Watson was seated only a few feet from Mickelson, and in front of the cameras, Mickelson compared Watson's leadership unfavorably to the pod system that captain Paul Azinger had used to win the Ryder Cup back in 2008, saying flatly that the 2014 players had been given almost no input into how the week was run. Nick Faldo, working that week as a television commentator, went after Mickelson immediately and hard. He accused him of throwing his own captain under the bus, in public, in the worst possible moment. His most quoted line from the broadcast painted the picture bluntly. The team arrived at Gleneagles on a shiny jumbo jet, Faldo said, and left with Phil driving the yellow school bus, having thrown his captain under it. Faldo argued that whatever problems the team had with Watson should have stayed private, handled behind closed doors rather than in front of a live microphone with the captain sitting right there. There's an irony in Faldo taking that position, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He had been Europe's losing Ryder Cup captain in 2008, the very year Mickelson kept holding up as the gold standard, and Faldo took plenty of criticism for it at the time. But Faldo made a point of noting the difference. His own players waited a couple of years before saying anything critical about his captaincy. They didn't do it standing next to him at a press conference an hour after the matches ended. Faldo's 2008 captaincy is worth understanding on its own terms, because it's the experience he kept returning to whenever he discussed Mickelson's conduct. His European team lost decisively to Azinger's pod system that year, and British newspapers were unsparing in their criticism of his tactical decisions, his pairings, and his general demeanor as captain. He absorbed that criticism largely in the weeks and months after the matches, through newspaper columns and post-tournament analysis, not in a live, unscripted moment with him sitting a few feet away. That distinction between criticism delivered through the normal channels of golf journalism after the fact and criticism delivered directly to a captain's face in a room full of cameras was the crux of Faldo's objection to what Mickelson did at Gleneagles. It wasn't that Mickelson had complaints. It was how, when, and where he chose to voice them. The fallout from Gleneagles had real consequences. The PGA Tour, responding to the American players' complaints, created a Ryder Cup task force that gave players significantly more say in how future teams were built and run. In that sense, Mickelson got the outcome he wanted. But the relationship with Watson took years to repair. Mickelson eventually apologized to him privately, and Watson accepted it, telling him it was over, whatever had been between them. The task force itself is an underappreciated part of this story, because it shows the pattern that would repeat throughout Mickelson's career. Public confrontation, initial backlash, and then, eventually, institutional change that moved in the direction he'd been pushing for. The task force included past captains, current players, and tour officials, and it fundamentally altered how U.S. Ryder Cup captains were selected and how team strategy was built in the years that followed. American Ryder Cup performances improved in the years after its creation, though it would be an overstatement to credit that improvement to Mickelson's press conference alone. Still, the sequence criticized publicly, take the heat, watch the institution eventually adapt, would show up again, on a much larger scale, less than a decade later. To most golf fans at the time, Gleneagles read as exactly what it looked like, an awkward, uncomfortable moment in a tense press conference, quickly forgotten once the next tournament started. Faldo's framing of it as something more significant, evidence of a pattern rather than a one-off outburst, wasn't widely embraced. It would take years and a much bigger conflict for that framing to look like anything more than one grumpy commentator's opinion. There's also a fairness point worth making about Watson's captaincy itself, separate from how Mickelson chose to raise it. The 2014 defeat wasn't simply a case of players inventing grievances to undermine a captain they didn't like. Watson's benching of Mickelson and Bradley through both Saturday sessions genuinely puzzled observers on both sides of the rivalry, including opposing players like Poulter, and the American team's body language throughout the week suggested real internal friction, not manufactured drama. None of that excuses the venue Mickelson chose for his criticism, sitting a few feet from his captain in front of live cameras, rather than raising it in a closed-door debrief afterward. But it does mean Faldo's harshest framing, that this was purely an act of personal ambition dressed up as candor, leaves out a legitimate underlying complaint about how that Ryder Cup team had actually been run. Money, media rights, and a warning sign. Few people noticed. Before Mickelson became the most prominent face of LIV golf, there was a quieter set of financial episodes that in hindsight showed a golfer increasingly frustrated with how the PGA Tour's business model worked, and increasingly willing to say so in public. In 2016, the Securities and Exchange Commission named Mickelson as a relief defendant in a civil insider trading case connected to Dean Foods. He wasn't criminally charged, but the SEC determined he had profited from illegal tips and required him to forfeit $931,738 in trading profits, plus $105,291 in interest. Around the same period, persistent reports and rumors circulated about large gambling losses. None of this proved anything about his later decisions, but it did establish a pattern, a golfer occasionally willing to take big financial risks outside the game itself. More directly relevant to what came later was Mickelson's growing public frustration with the PGA Tour's control over media rights. He complained openly about what he called the Tour's obnoxious greed, specifically around who profited from footage of famous shots. He pointed to his own pine straw shot from the 13th hole at the 2010 Masters, a moment replayed constantly on television and online, noting that even a short clip of it could cost tens of thousands of dollars to license each time it aired, money that went to the tour rather than to him. He also objected to appearing in tour-produced projects, including a Netflix documentary series, without direct compensation. His argument in simple terms was that the biggest stars generated the value that made the tour worth watching, and that the tour's system of pooling media rights to fund purses and player pensions shortchanged the players actually creating the highlights. He even floated the idea of building his own direct-to-fan broadcast, with cameras and microphones mounted on his own hat, his caddy's hat, and his bag, letting fans watch his round unfiltered by the tour's production. His agent, Steve Loy, reportedly explored a TV career for him and suggested that traditional network money simply couldn't compete with what Mickelson could earn by controlling his own media rights directly. None of this proved Mickelson was preparing to leave the PGA Tour, but it painted a picture of a player who had come to see the tour's traditional structure, built around shared rights and collective purses, as an obstacle to what he believed he was owed. That belief would matter enormously a few years later. It's worth pausing on the media rights argument specifically, because it's the part of Mickelson's case that holds up best on its own terms, independent of anything else going on with him at the time. The PGA Tour's model has always worked by pooling broadcast and licensing revenue centrally and redistributing it through purses, pensions, and other player benefits, rather than paying individual stars directly for the commercial value their own highlights generate. That system has real advantages. It spreads money to journeymen and rank-and-file players who'd otherwise get almost nothing from a sport built around a handful of recognizable stars. But it also means a player like Mickelson, whose highlights were replayed constantly and whose face sold tickets and sponsorships for decades, had limited direct claim on the value his own career created. Framed that way, his complaint wasn't simply about greed. It was a genuine structural critique of how a mostly non-union, mostly individual sport decides who gets paid for what. The problem in Faldo's eyes wasn't that Mickelson raised the issue. It was the conclusion he eventually drew from it. The LIV Golf break in 2022, Mickelson's private role in helping build the Saudi-backed LIV Golf League became public, largely through interviews he gave to biographer Alan Shipnuck. Mickelson described his Saudi financial backers in blunt, unflattering terms, but defended the arrangement anyway, saying it gave him leverage to force change at the PGA Tour. He also repeated his obnoxious greed criticism of the tour's business practices. The backlash was immediate. Mickelson stepped away from competitive golf for a stretch, skipping the 2022 Masters and missing his chance to defend his 2021 PGA Championship title at Southern Hills. It was during CBS's broadcast of that 2022 PGA Championship that Faldo delivered what may be his most quoted line about Mickelson. Asked by anchor Jim Nantz to weigh in on Mickelson's absence, Nantz took the softer position, suggesting Mickelson could eventually return to a forgiving American public. Faldo was more direct. He said that if Mickelson wanted to protect his legacy, he needed to come back to the PGA Tour because that was where he'd built everything and where he was already a legend. Adding that everyone knew there was another option out there if what Mickelson wanted instead was guaranteed money. It's worth noting what Faldo didn't say. He wasn't dismissive of Mickelson's talent. In that same conversation, he called Mickelson's 2021 PGA Championship win at age 50 the oldest major champion in golf history, one of the greatest achievements the sport had ever seen. Faldo's argument wasn't that Mickelson lacked greatness. It was that greatness earned through guaranteed money, outside the sport's traditional competitive structure, would be remembered differently than greatness earned by beating a full field for a paycheck that wasn't promised in advance. Mickelson didn't take the advice. He reportedly signed a contract with LIV Golf worth around $200 million, becoming one of the league's most recognizable faces. Set against that decision is a genuinely uncomfortable fact for anyone trying to tell this story as a simple morality tale. Mickelson's gamble worked, at least by the measures he cared about most. The PGA Tour, under sustained pressure from LIV's checkbook and the threat of losing more of its stars, responded by dramatically increasing its own purses and creating new equity and bonus programs designed to reward the players who stayed loyal to the traditional tour. Players who never left the PGA Tour ended up earning meaningfully more money because Mickelson and others were willing to walk away from it. That's an outcome Mickelson has pointed to as vindication. And it's not an unreasonable thing to point to. The tour Faldo wanted protected changed, in some ways for the better for the players still on it, largely because Mickelson forced the issue. Faldo versus the league itself, Faldo's criticism didn't stop at Mickelson. He turned much of it toward LIV Golf's structure as a whole, calling it exhibition golf rather than real competition. His argument was mostly economic. He said LIV's smaller fields meant that plenty of largely unknown players were competing for tournament purses worth $25 million, that mid-tier players nearing retirement or coming off injuries were earning far more than they ever could on a traditional tour for the same level of golf, and that a handful of superstars were being paid enormous sums without meaningfully raising the league's profile, while other players were locked out of the format entirely. He also questioned whether LIV could function as a sustainable business at all. comparing its funding model to a company that keeps borrowing and losing money indefinitely without ever facing normal financial consequences. He called some of the league's player signings bonkers, specifically criticizing the decision to celebrate recruiting golfers ranked around 250th or 350th in the world. He pointed to Joaquin Niemann, one of LIV's designated stars, as a player who had earned roughly $20 million without producing results in major championships, and to Mark Leishman, who had reportedly earned around $10 million on the league while largely disappearing from the sport's wider public conversation. In Faldo's view, this wasn't really about golf at all. It was about a small number of established stars, Mickelson chief among them, lending their credibility to a structure that rewarded financial participation over competitive merit. There's a version of this argument that LIV's defenders would push back on, and it's worth stating plainly, rather than letting Faldo's critique stand unopposed. Every young sports league in history has needed to overpay in its early years to attract attention and talent, and judging a 3-year-old venture by the standards of a 100-year-old institution like the PGA Tour arguably stacks the deck. Guaranteed money is also not unheard of in professional sports. More broadly, plenty of leagues pay players fixed salaries rather than purely results-based prize money. And nobody accuses the NBA or the NFL of not being real competition because of it. Mickelson and LIV's other defenders have made versions of that case. Faldo's response, consistently, has been that golf is different specifically because its entire cultural identity, going back generations, has been built on the idea that you earn what you take home, hole by hole, with nothing guaranteed in advance. Whether that distinction is a meaningful one, or just nostalgia dressed up as principle is, again, something reasonable people disagree about. It's also worth noting that Faldo made these arguments from a fairly comfortable position himself, decades removed from needing to compete for a paycheck. That doesn't make his critique wrong, but it's a fair thing for a viewer to weigh. A man secure in his own legacy and his own finances, criticizing a peer for making decisions under very different competitive and financial pressures than Faldo himself ever faced at that stage of his career. Mickelson, by his late 40s, was watching his prime playing years wind down, aware that his ability to earn at an elite level through traditional tour golf had a limited runway left. Faldo's warnings came from someone who never had to make that particular calculation. A quiet dinner at Augusta. One of the clearest signs that the split had become personal, not just professional, showed up at an event with no scoreboard at all. The Masters Champions Dinner, held every year at Augusta National for past Green Jacket winners. It's one of the most exclusive gatherings in golf, built entirely around shared history and mutual respect among champions. The arrival of LIV Golf made that dinner noticeably uncomfortable. Fuzzy Zoeller, a past champion, said that at the 2023 dinner, Mickelson sat near the end of the table and didn't speak at all. The following year, during a Sky Sports broadcast at the 2024 Masters, Faldo described the same dynamic firsthand, saying Mickelson had been dead quiet on the Tuesday of the dinner, standing right next to him without saying a word, and adding pointedly that he wondered why. On a later podcast appearance, Faldo elaborated, saying, "Some players made the dinner a little awkward, singling out Mickelson specifically, and tying it to how outspoken he'd been in criticizing the tour, suggesting it might be simplest to just let those players get on with their own world. It's worth being careful about what a quiet dinner actually proves. Silence isn't a confession of anything, and there could be plenty of explanations for it that have nothing to do with guilt or shame, a room full of former Masters champions, many of whom had spent the previous 2 years publicly sparring with each other in the press over LIV Golf, would be an uncomfortable place for almost anyone to sit regardless of which side of the divide they'd landed on." Mickelson has never been the only LIV defector at that table, and it's worth asking whether the coverage singled him out partly because he was already the sport's most talked about controversial figure, making a story about his silence more newsworthy than an identical story about someone else's. Still, the contrast was hard to miss for people who'd followed Mickelson's career from the start. A player once known as the most fan-friendly, talkative thumbs-up presence in American golf, sitting silently at a table built specifically to celebrate the shared community he had, in Faldo's telling, chosen to walk away from. Whatever the full explanation, it was a visible, physical marker of how far the relationship between Mickelson and golf's old guard had traveled since Gleneagles. 2026, a separate, serious set of allegations. In 2026, Mickelson's public standing dropped further, in a way that has nothing directly to do with the Ryder Cup, LIV Golf, or Champions Dinners. He was reported to be facing allegations of sexual misconduct, along with reports that his membership at a well-known California golf club had been revoked over alleged inappropriate behavior. Journalist Alan Shipnuck reported that Mickelson was accused of showing a nude photograph of himself to Ashley Perez, the former wife of professional golfer Pat Perez, during a tournament near New York. These are allegations, not proven facts. And Mickelson has not been criminally charged in connection with them as far as the available reporting shows. Within hours of the report surfacing, Mickelson withdrew from the 2026 Open Championship, which reportedly ended a 36-year streak of major championship appearances. A remarkable run by any measure, now interrupted under difficult circumstances. It's important to be precise here. Nothing in Faldo's public commentary over the past decade predicted or referenced anything like this, and it would be a mistake to pretend otherwise. His criticism of Mickelson was always about institutional loyalty, money, and public conduct toward colleagues, not personal behavior of this kind. Connecting the 2026 allegations to Faldo's earlier warnings as though he foresaw them would be unfair to both men and would misrepresent what Faldo actually said over the years. He was talking about press conferences, media contracts, and league defections. He was not at any point making claims about Mickelson's personal conduct outside of golf, and nothing in the record suggests he had any basis to. What can fairly be said is that these allegations landed at a moment when Mickelson's relationship with golf's traditional community was already strained, a community he had by his own choices drifted away from over the preceding decade. A player with deeper, more current ties to the tour, to the champions' dinner table, to the network of former teammates and rivals who make up professional golf's inner circle, might have found more people willing to publicly defend him, or at least withhold judgment in the early hours after the reports broke. Mickelson, by 2026, had spent years positioning himself as an outsider to that community by choice. When the allegations surfaced, there was noticeably little public defense of him from within the sport, a silence that says something about where he stood with his peers by that point, independent of whatever the allegations themselves turn out to mean. For what it's worth, Faldo has continued applying the same blunt standard to other legends, not just Mickelson. In 2026, he also criticized Tiger Woods for continuing to attempt competitive golf through serious physical pain, describing some of Woods' physical decline as self-inflicted, and calling the PGA Tour predictably weak for not holding him to the same standards it would apply to other players. Whatever else can be said about Faldo, he hasn't reserved his criticism for Mickelson alone. It's also worth being honest about the limits of what's publicly known at this stage. Reporting on the 2026 allegations has come primarily through one journalist, Alan Shipnuck, whose past reporting on Mickelson, including the 2022 interviews about LIV Golf, has generally proven accurate, but has also drawn criticism from Mickelson's camp as being unfair or selectively framed. No criminal charges have been reported in connection with the 2026 allegations as of this writing, and Mickelson has not publicly confirmed the specific details attributed to him. The revoked club membership, the withdrawal from the Open Championship, and the end of his 36-year major streak are documented, verifiable facts. The underlying allegations themselves remain allegations, and treating them as anything more than that, however consistent they might seem with the broader story of Mickelson's drift from golf's traditional community, would go beyond what the available reporting actually supports. Readers following this story closely should watch for further reporting, official statements, or any legal proceedings before drawing firmer conclusions than the current record allows. Two ways of thinking about the same career strip away the individual incidents, and what's left is a genuine disagreement about what professional golf owes its stars and what its stars owe the game in return. Faldo's view, consistent across 3 decades of commentary, holds that golf's institutions, its tours, its team competitions, its historical records deserve loyalty even when they're flawed, that disputes belong behind closed doors, and that a legacy is built through competitive merit inside a shared structure that everyone agrees to play by. Mickelson's approach, visible from Gleneagles through the media rights fight to a LIV Golf, has been more transactional. Loyalty to any institution is conditional on that institution. Treating him fairly public pressure is a legitimate tool for forcing change. And a star's leverage, financial and otherwise, is something to be used rather than set aside out of deference to tradition. Neither view is obviously wrong. Mickelson's pressure campaign against the PGA Tour, whatever one thinks of how he waged it, coincided with real changes. Higher purses, new equity programs for players who stayed on tour, and a broader conversation about how much control players should have over their own commercial value. Watson's Ryder Cup captaincy really was controversial, and Mickelson wasn't alone in questioning it. Faldo, for his part, was never a neutral or universally beloved figure himself. He built his own reputation on rules, enforced without warmth, and it's fair to ask whether some of his harshest lines about Mickelson carried an edge of old rivalry as much as principle. What can be said with more confidence is that Faldo was from a fairly early point articulating a specific worry, that Mickelson's willingness to put personal leverage above institutional loyalty applied repeatedly over a long career would eventually cost him something beyond money. Whether that's what actually happened, the quiet dinner table at Augusta, the missed majors, the distance from old teammates, is something reasonable people can look at the same evidence and disagree about. It also helps to remember that this same tension between institutional loyalty and individual leverage shows up constantly outside golf, in every profession where a handful of stars generate most of the value inside a larger shared system. Musicians fight record labels over royalties, actors fight studios over streaming residuals, athletes in team sports fight leagues over salary caps and free agency rights. In almost every one of those fights, the individual pushing for more control gets criticized, at least initially, for breaking with tradition or putting themselves ahead of the collective, and in almost every one of those fights, the system usually ends up changing at least partly in the direction the individual was pushing. Mickelson's dispute with the PGA Tour fits that pattern closely. What makes his version distinctive is the specific vehicle he chose: a league backed by a foreign sovereign wealth fund with its own well-documented human rights controversies, which gave his critics a much sharper edge to attack him with than a simple pay dispute would have provided on its own. Where it leaves him, Mickelson's career numbers aren't in dispute. 6 major championships, 45 PGA Tour wins, more than any left-hander in the sport's history. A PGA Championship win at 50 years old that Faldo himself, his sharpest public critic, called one of the greatest achievements the game has ever produced. Those results don't disappear because of anything that happened afterward, and they shouldn't be read backward through the lens of controversies that came years later. At the same time, the arc of the last decade is hard to ignore. A public break with a Ryder Cup captain, a running fight with the tour over money and control, a jump to a Saudi-backed league that split the sport and cost him relationships with old teammates and rivals, and now allegations still unproven that have interrupted one of the longest active streaks in major championship golf. Faldo's warnings, delivered without much warmth and not always fairly, turned out to track that arc more closely than most people expected back in 2014, when it all looked like one uncomfortable press conference and nothing more. Whether that makes Faldo prophetic or just consistently skeptical of a player he never much cared for is, in the end, a matter of interpretation. It's also worth remembering that hindsight makes almost any consistent critic look prescient. Eventually, Faldo said plenty of harsh things about plenty of players over the decades. And it's fair to ask how much of the "he saw it coming" narrative is a product of Mickelson's story turning out the way it did, rather than proof that Faldo had some unique insight nobody else possessed. Plenty of golf commentators and plenty of fans raised similar concerns about the Ryder Cup dispute, the media rights fight, and the LIV golf move as they happened. Faldo wasn't a lone prophet shouting into the void. He was one of the loudest and most consistent voices in a chorus that, for a long time, the wider golf audience mostly chose not to listen to. What isn't in question is that one of the most talented and popular golfers of his generation now finds himself further from the game's traditional community than at any point in his career. The numbers on his resume are permanent. 6 majors, 45 tour wins, a win at 50 that changed what people thought was possible in competitive golf. Those achievements don't get erased by anything that happened after them, and they shouldn't be. But the distance between Mickelson and the sport that made him measured in silent dinners, missed majors, and broken relationships with old teammates is real too, and it's the part of the story that Nick Faldo, for all his prickliness, was talking about years before most people were ready to take it seriously. There's no tidy way to close a story like this, because it isn't over. Mickelson is still alive, still capable of playing competitive golf, and still, by most accounts, capable of surprising people, for better or worse, the way he has for 3 decades. Whether the current chapter represents the permanent end of his standing in the sport's traditional institutions, or just its lowest point so far, is something only time will settle. Faldo, for his part, has never claimed any satisfaction in being right about any of it. His criticism was always framed as concern for the game and, in his own gruff way, for Mickelson's legacy specifically, not as score settling for old grievances. Whether that framing was sincere or self-serving is, like almost everything else in this rivalry, a matter for the audience to decide for itself. Two men, two very different philosophies. One long, unresolved, ongoing, defining argument, still playing out about what professional golf is ultimately supposed to reward. Fans will keep taking sides. Commentators will keep revisiting the old quotes, and golf itself will keep changing shape around the argument, whether or not either man ever fully wins it, or ever agrees on what winning it would even mean.
And I'm always trying to get better at what I do.
That's why he has to curve it too much. He's only 100.
So where's he going to hit this, right over?
He knew. Butch Harmon knew Phil Mickelson was special, but Harmon also knew the flaw that would follow Phil everywhere. For a long time, Phil was one of the most loved players in golf. Fans called him Phil the Thrill. They loved his daring shots and his warm smile. Then came Live Golf. Phil helped build a new league backed by Saudi money. He said sharp things about the PGA Tour. He talked about using the new league to gain leverage. Many fans felt let down. The man they once cheered now looked reckless to them. I'm James, and this is Golf Relived. Here is the strange part. Years before all of this, Harmon had already seen the real problem with Phil. As this story builds, give this video some hype if you think the truth about Phil was hiding in plain sight, because Harmon saw it long before the rest of golf wanted to admit it. Now, let me be fair. Harmon never said Live would happen. He did not predict it. That is not the claim here. But when Live blew up, many fans looked back at Harmon's old words in a new way. Harmon had warned for years about Phil's choices. He had warned about Phil's love of risk. He had warned that Phil did not always show good judgment under pressure. The LIV story showed two sides of Phil at once. He was brave enough to challenge the most powerful body in golf. That took nerve. But he was also reckless enough to start a storm that swallowed him whole. Harmon understood that Phil's points about the tour had real truth in them. Yet the way Phil handled it all made him look careless. That mix of brave and reckless was not new. It was the oldest thing about Phil. Harmon had seen it for years. To understand why Harmon was right, we have to go back. We have to look at the swing. And we have to start with the truth that Phil was, and still is, brilliant. Phil had gifts most players only dream about. He had rare flexibility, he had natural power. He had a short game that looked like magic. He could hit shots that no one else would even try. From behind a tree, from deep rough, from a bad lie near the green, Phil found a way to score. He could open the face of a wedge and float the ball high in the air, then watch it land soft and stop dead by the hole. Crowds always gasped at shots like that. He was never boring. He was never robotic. He played golf like an artist, not a machine. That is exactly why fans loved him. But this is also where the problem begins. The same gifts that made Phil exciting also made him very hard to coach. Phil trusted feel. He trusted his hands. He loved risk. He believed he could escape any trouble because most of the time he actually could. That belief made him dangerous to his rivals. It also made him dangerous to himself. To see that danger clearly, look at one famous day. It was the 2006 US Open at Winged Foot. Phil came to the final hole needing only a par to win. A par would have handed him the trophy. Most players in that spot would play safe. They would take an iron off the tee, find the fairway, and protect the lead. The hole was tight. The rough was thick and long. The smart play was clear to almost everyone watching. Phil did not do that. He pulled out his driver. He swung hard. He missed badly and sent the ball flying left into trouble. From there, it fell apart. He had to scramble, and he could not save par. He made double bogey on the last hole. He lost the US Open by a single shot, and he gave it away himself. In that moment, Phil said something the whole golf world remembers. He said, "I am such an idiot. That line matters." Phil was not short on talent that day. He had enough talent to win many majors. The problem was not skill. The problem was control. He had a safe path right in front of him, and he chose the risky one. That choice cost him a major. Here's the key point. This collapse happened before Harmon became his coach. But it showed the exact problem Harmon would later try to fix. It was a warning sign written in plain sight. After that loss, Phil went to Harmon for help. This was a smart move. Harmon was the most respected swing coach of his time. He came from a famous golf family, and he had spent his whole life around the game. He had guided Tiger Woods through his most dominant years. He had a sharp eye and a blunt, honest way of speaking. Harmon knew elite golf better than almost anyone alive. Harmon looked at Phil's swing and saw the truth fast. The swing was beautiful. It was also unstable. Let me explain it in simple terms. Phil's swing got too long at the top. His arms went too far back. His body turn and his arm swing did not always match up. They worked against each other instead of together. When that happened, the club could drift out of place. To save the shot, Phil had to use his hands at the last second to square the club. It was like trying to catch something falling and flip it the right way all at once. Sometimes his hands got there in time, sometimes they did not. That is why his driving was wild. One miss flew hard left. Another snapped. Right, on a good week, he got away with it. On a bad week, it cost him everything. Harman had a clear plan. He wanted a shorter swing. He wanted the arms to stop before going too far back. He wanted a wider arc, with the hands kept away from the head. This would keep the club on a better path. It would take the late hand save out of the swing. In short, Harman wanted Phil to stop chasing drama and start playing golf he could repeat. This was good advice. It was correct advice. And here is where the heart of the story begins. Harman and Phil would work for hours on the practice range. Phil could hit the shorter, controlled swing. He could do exactly what Harman asked. On the range, it looked great. Ball after ball would fly straight and true. The fix clearly worked when Phil let it work. The problem came when the tournament started. As soon as Phil stepped onto the first tee, he often went back to the long, loose swing that felt natural to him. Under pressure, his old habit took over. He left the good habits on the range. He carried the old habits into the round. Think about what that means. Phil did not fail because he lacked the right information. Harman gave him the right information again and again. Phil failed because he would not stay loyal to it. He knew the fix. He just would not trust it when it mattered most. This is the simple truth at the center of everything. Phil never listened. Not because he was foolish. He was one of the smartest players in the game. He did not listen because he loved his own way too much to give it up. Now I want to be fair again, because Harman was not just right about the flaws. He was right about the cure too, and the best proof is this. When Phil listened, Phil won. During the Harman years, Phil won 15 titles around the world. He won the 2010 Masters. He won the 2013 Open Championship. These were not lucky wins. They were the result of better control. The 2013 Open at Muirfield is the clearest proof of all. The conditions were hard. The ground was baked and fast. The wind was strong. Phil was 5 shots behind the leader going into the final day. On a day like that, the old Phil might have forced things. He might have pulled driver again and again and hoped for magic. He didn't. Instead, Phil played smart. He kept the driver in the bag when he needed to. He used woods and irons to control the ball on the firm ground. He kept his shots low and under the wind. He played for position instead of chasing every flag. He picked safe targets and stuck to them. He trusted his short game and his putting to do the rest. He shot a final round of 66, one of the best rounds of the day, and he won by 3 shots. That victory was not Phil being wild. It was Phil being controlled. It was Phil doing exactly what Harman had been asking for. It was the highest point of his career, and it came from discipline, not drama. Harman's plan worked. The proof was a trophy. So you would think Phil would hold on to that coach and that plan forever. He did not. By late 2015, Phil had gone 2 seasons without a win since that Open victory. He grew restless. He decided he wanted to hear new ideas from a fresh point of view. So he made a choice that says a lot about him. He flew his private plane to Las Vegas to meet Harman face to face. The two sat down for a long breakfast at the Rio Seco Club, the home of Harman's golf school. Over that meal, they ended their partnership. The split was calm and respectful. There were no hard feelings between them. But look closely at why it happened. Phil did not leave because Harman's advice was wrong. He left because he was tired of hearing the same advice. One respected teacher, Steve Wozniak, made this point at the time. He said Phil had simply grown tired of hearing the same correct words year after year. And he gave a sharp warning. He said any new ideas Phil heard from a new coach would likely be worse, because Harman's basics were rock solid and hard to beat. Think about how unusual that is. Phil did not need a new truth. He had the truth already. He had it in his hands for 8 years. He just did not want to hear it anymore. He wanted something that felt fresh and exciting, even if it was not a sound. He chose comfort over what was correct. After Harman, Phil hired a coach named Andrew Getson. This is not about blaming Getson. Getson tried to help. He worked on Phil's posture and tried to make the swing more compact again. The point is not the new coach. The point is that the problem itself never went away. Here is the proof. In 2021, Phil won the PGA Championship at Kiwawa Island. It was a huge win. He became the oldest player ever to win a major. It was a wonderful moment. But watch what Phil was doing between shots that week. He kept making slow practice swings with just his left arm down the fairway. Why? He was trying to force a wider arc and stop his arms from collapsing at the top. That was the very same fault Harman had been fixing years before. Let that sink in. Phil left the teacher, but he never escaped the lesson. He spent years running from the same flaw, even while winning. The problem followed him because it lived inside his own habits. Now the story moves off the golf course, because Phil's love of risk was never only about driver against iron. It showed up in his life too. We need to handle this part with care, and we will only say what is known. Phil had a long and complicated relationship with a famous sports bettor named Billy Walters. Walters later wrote about it in a book. He described a friendship that was tangled up with gambling, and he said Phil had built up very large gambling debts over time. This is where it grew serious. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission looked into a case about Dean Foods stock. The agency named Phil as what is called a relief defendant. It said Walters had passed Phil tips that helped him make almost $1 million in trading profits. It said Phil then used that money to help pay his gambling debts to Walters. Phil settled the civil case. He agreed to repay the profits plus interest. He was not charged with any crime. Now, let me be clear about what this does and does not show. Harman did not predict any of this. No one is saying that. But notice the pattern. The same hunger for risk that made Phil pull driver on the wrong hole also showed up in his money and his bets. It was the same instinct in a different place. He liked the big swing and the big reward. No matter the cost, the thrill was the thread that ran through it all. On the course and off it, Phil chased the big play. He trusted himself to come out fine, just as he always had on the green. Harman had seen that pattern in golf. The rest of the world saw it spill into everything else. Which brings us back, at last, to LIV Golf. In late 2021 and early 2022, Phil stood at the center of the biggest split golf had ever seen. He worked with Saudi backers to help build the LIV League. In one interview he was not meant to give, Phil said something striking. He admitted he was not even sure the new league would succeed. He said the real goal was leverage. He wanted to use LIV as a tool to force the PGA Tour to change. He accused the tour of using heavy-handed tactics and of holding too much power over players. He felt players had no real say and no real choice. It was a bold thing to say out loud, and it was also a risky one. The backlash was huge. Fans turned on him. Other players spoke against him. Phil pulled back from the game for about 4 months, almost in hiding. It looked once again like Phil had caused a storm he could not control. But here's the twist that proves Harman's eye was sharp. Harman was one of the few big voices who stood up for the core of Phil's point. He did not defend everything Phil did. He was honest about the money. He said many players who left for LIV should just admit they went for the cash, and he called their excuses about growing the game empty talk. Yet Harman also said Phil was not wrong about the tour. He said Phil's criticism had real truth inside it, and then something happened that proved Harman right. The PGA Tour started to change. It brought in special events with much bigger prize money. It raised player pay. It changed its schedule. These were the very kinds of changes Phil had pushed for. The tour moved because it suddenly had a rival. In other words, Phil handled the moment badly, but he was not wrong about the problem. And Harman once again had seen the truth before most people would admit it. So where does that leave us with Phil Mickelson? Let me end where fairness demands. Phil remains one of the most gifted and exciting golfers who ever lived. He gave fans shots they will remember forever. He won 6 majors. He played with a joy and a daring that few could match. The game is richer because he was in it. But here's the quiet tragedy at the heart of his story. Phil's greatest gift was tied to his greatest flaw. The two could not be pulled apart. He believed in the impossible so deeply that he often refused the simple. He could pull off the miracle, so he kept reaching for it, even when the safe play was right there in front of him. That belief gave us magic. It gave us shots no one will ever forget. But it also cost him majors peace, and at times his good name. Harman saw it early. He saw it long before anyone else was willing to. He saw the swing that needed control. He saw the choices that needed restraint. He saw the truth about the tour. He tried to help Phil with all of it. And year after year, the story of Phil's swing, his choices, and his battles made Harman look right. the man. He knew Phil was special, and he knew the flaw that would follow him everywhere. Phil never listened, and in the end, that may be the most Phil Mickelson thing of all.